I was late to work that night, but I was always late. Being late was my thing, which is why my thing was also not lasting too long at jobs. I had been working the night shift at 4Q for 3 months, and that, for me, was an amazing run. Just a shockingly long stretch of time. The equivalent of the gap between the mammoth scampering across the frozen tundra to the first time someone made nachos. Fucking millennia, basically. When I walked in through the sliding glass doors that used to ding before they broke and could now only wheeze a sad little noise, I knew something was wrong. Almost everything was the same. The day since last robbery sign taped up to the wall behind the cash register with numbers written and crossed out and rewritten on it. Tonight the number read 9, which wasn't bad. 30s was when you would start to worry. Made you feel like you were due, because that's how life worked. There are those who rob and those who get robbed, and whenever there is a long period between the former and the latter, you feel like you aren't working. You're simply waiting to be robbed. Behind me, the automatic doors slid shut automatically. Night air stayed outside, trapped in the parking lot with bright LED streetlights and 12 empty parking spots, and the giant illuminated store sign that glowed like a bright red pulsing heart. In front of me were Nick, who worked the 3 to 11 shift, should have been, was instead Emmanuel. Emmanuel, the owner. Emmanuel, who was, I was sure, about to fire me. I awkwardly acknowledged him, already feeling kind of sad I wouldn't get to say goodbye to Nick. Nick was a fuck-up like me, just an older version of me, an ex-mechanic who hurt his back at work years ago. He went to jail or something for some vague reason, and now he worked at the Fort Q, which was like a realist version of Dante's Purgatory. Nick was a semi-alright guy, friendly, the kind of dude who would help you move or could get you weed. But more importantly, Nick was like looking at a mirror I sent back in time from the future, a reminder of who I could become, of where I might end. And now, I assumed that ending was beginning. "Hey, Emmanuel, I'm really sorry I'm late," I began, but he cut me off. "The cops were here today, Tim." Emmanuel's facial expression was cryptic. He usually looked angry, sometimes incredulous, often hungry, but this wasn't any of those. "Did we get robbed again?" "No, we did not get robbed again." He pointed at the cash register sign. "We're at 9. 9's a good number." "Yeah, it is." He rubbed his palms against his shapeless khakis. They were the kind with the stretched waistband so you didn't need a belt. "This has not been an easy day." "The cops," he coughed. "They were for you. They were here for you." "Why would the cops want to talk to me?" There were thousands of reasons. I shuddered at the grotesque amount of reasons the cops would want to talk to me. Cops would love to talk to me. Would love to. Millions of reasons. "They had personal news for you. They said they couldn't get in touch. Your phone doesn't work," they said. "It doesn't work?" I nodded sadly. "Why doesn't your phone work?" I thought about trying to explain the deep awfulness of not having a functioning phone in a society that believed everyone had a phone, and how that made me feel like I wasn't even real, like my failures in capitalism had erased me. "But how do you say that to your boss?" I shrugged instead, and he continued. "Also, they said your address is a paper address?" He looked baffled. "What does paper address mean?" "It means I wrote down the name of a fake street on my driver's license. I actually live in an abandoned house about 3 blocks away from here." "Oh, I'm a squatter," I added cheerfully. "It's fine until winter. Deep winter, really. But what do they want to talk to me about?" A customer walked in and began to browse the high-sodium corn-based chip selection. Emmanuel sighed dramatically. "At first they told me it was private. They needed to talk to you directly. I told them they could tell me. I told them I'm like your father." "Manny, you aren't like my dad at all. Did they tell you anything?" The customer in the high-sodium corn-based chip aisle was obviously listening. "Yes." A long pause. Emmanuel stared off into the distance like he was a sailor and the drink section was the stupid sea he was going to drown in and never see his family again. "Manny? What was it?" "It's Emmanuel," he replied automatically, "not Manny." "Sorry." He was obviously waiting. "Sorry, Emmanuel." He nodded and spoke in a low voice without making eye contact. They told me your grandfather is dying. The customer gasped and then tried to cover it up with coughing. He put a big, weird, hairy hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do. No, it's cool. It's cool? Slightly bug-eyed at the best time, his expression took on a cartoonish intensity as he pulled his hand off my shoulder. It's cool? Your grandfather is dying and it's cool? That came out wrong, I said. I don't know him, never met him. So it's sad that he's dying, but it's not sad. Is it like your mailman died? The customer asked, putting his combos down on the counter. Like that kind of sad? Not even mailman death sad. More like replacement mailman death sad. God, that's not so sad. Exactly. Maybe he's dying and he's my grandpa, but it's not like he's my grandpa dying. I don't know if I would even recognize him if he was right on the other side of the counter. Emmanuel stared at the customer. Manny, it's not him. That's not my grandpa. He's in the hospital, remember? Right, of course. Emmanuel sighed and swiped his customer's item. Just the special edition pork combos for you tonight, sir? Just the pork combos, said the customer, then turning to me. I'm sorry. That's okay. Things happen. The man walked out with his combos, out into the fluorescent-colored parking lot night. Emmanuel hesitated for a minute, then cleared his throat. He wants to see you, even if he doesn't matter to you. I think maybe you matter more to him than you realize. Maybe he realizes that now as he gets closer to death. Behind us, the 7 hot dogs in the rotating hot dog grill rotated sickly. The forever sticky fizz magic machine hummed to itself. Thanks, Manny. It's no problem, but it's Emmanuel, not Manny, you squatter fuck. He reached behind him and grabbed his coat. Do you want to clock in here? Because I'm not working at night. That's when we get robbed. You work at night, you get robbed. Besides, you were late. Get it together. Of course I was late. I punched my employee number into the register. A little printout word showing my time logged in. I balled it up and shot it at the trash can. It missed. My grandpa's in the hospital. You should be happy I'm working tonight at all. Oh, and hey, I actually have a question. Uh-huh. Emmanuel locked his register and walked out into the store. His black shoes squeaked on the shiny tile floor. There's a dead deer in the parking lot. Is that, going to be picked up or something? Emmanuel kept walking. I'm sorry about your grandfather, Tim, and I'm not talking about that goddamn deer. The entire next day, I facilitated between going to see him and not going to see him, and by the time I decided to visit, it was nearly 7 at night. Since it was October, the skies were dark and the streetlights were out. Shadows followed me as I walked, spreading over the scattering of red and yellow leaves that covered the old and uneven sidewalks. Dark birds swooped across the darkening skies and rain began to fall. A cold light mist as I crossed the parking lot and went into the main entrance. The place was deserted. Just the janitor pushing the mop and a guy sitting at the front desk texting. He didn't look up. I walked by him in the closed gift shop and walked to the almost empty cafeteria. The cop had asked him there, and I saw him immediately when I walked in. He was in the front wearing a cheap sport coat with no tie, the kind of jeans you could buy in a members-only discount factory store for under $20. Hair in a buzz cut, high and tight. Mustache. Serious high school football coach history teacher vibes. He was chatting with the cashier, but his eyes kept slipping away to scan the room. When he saw me, he nodded in greeting and gestured with his coffee cup to an empty table. I slouched across the room, pulling my damp black hoodie around me. Tim? Thanks for meeting me here. No problem. I'm Detective Franklin. You can call me Frank. Most people do. Your name's Frank Franklin? No, it's actually Maurice Franklin, but who wants to be called Maurice? A glance at my damp clothes. Got caught in the rain, huh? A real detective. Yeah, almost made it. Almost only counts in, what is it again? Horseshoes and hand grenades? That's close, not almost. Huh. Guess almost don't count for shit then. He slurped his coffee. The dim light from the ceiling caught and glowed on the ring on his third finger of his right hand, a silver band with a tan middle section. He saw me notice and raised an eyebrow. You like? I had this made. This part is the first deer I ever shot. He traces a finger along it. That's the antler there, in the middle. You read the Bible? Not, often. God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Genesis 1:26-28. He cracked his knuckles, leaned forward over the table. We have the right to do whatever we want with the earth. It was made for us. I slid backward in my chair a little. He watched me and smiled a bit. I'm glad you came. Mr. Dreesen wanted to see his family before the end, and I offered to help out. He's an old friend of mine. I owe him some favors. But it turns out you are the only family he's got left. I guess I am, I said. My dad died a couple of years ago. A bad end from liver disease. At least, that's what I thought it was. We had sort of lost contact before that. I missed his deathbed scene. You don't have to be the very Reverend Freud to connect the dots as to why I had decided to come to the hospital. End of the dressing line, the cop said. But you weren't close to your grandfather. Not at all, I admitted. I looked around the empty cafeteria. I hadn't eaten dinner and I was starving, but there was no food anywhere. When did you see him last? I never saw him at all. I drummed my fingers on my knees. This wasn't going how I thought it would. You sure? He had a weird little smile when he said that, and my brain flashed. A scene of driving in the rain, my parents in the front seat, an old strange house, me holding a little toy car in my hand. The plastic was hot. Someone talking, but I couldn't quite see them. I shook my head as if I was trying to clear it, and he laughed, stood up. Don't let me keep you. Go ahead and see him. He's on the 3rd floor. He leaned over me and I smelled aftershave and cigar smoke. He patted me on my shoulder and I winced at the cold, hard metal of his ring. Have a nice visit, kid. Family is all we have. The 3rd floor never felt emptier. No nurses holding charts. No workers pushing food carts. No visitors with red eyes and stoic shoulders. Everything was bright and vacant. The only person I could see was the nurse standing behind the desk. I'm looking for someone. His name is Carl Dressen. Someone told me he's in here, I said. I wasn't sure what to say. My shirt was still wet from the rain and the room was cold. She stared impassively at me with light blue eyes, not speaking. She was tall, with slumped shoulders and long black hair. I'm his grandson, I hastily added. I can tell, she said. Her eyes focused not on me, but what felt like something directly behind me. Like she could see right through me. You work here long enough, you see the faces of the old and the faces of the young, and I've worked here a long time. She began to type. Her fingertips were stained yellow from smoking. The blue computer screen glowed against her hollowed-out face, making her look like a broken statue. I scanned the signs behind her for listed visiting hours, but I couldn't find any. For a second, I was seized with a sudden conviction I had come too late. I would have to leave, and he would die that night without ever seeing me. After having finally decided to come here, it felt like having taken that away would be too much. Dressen, room 777. You're just in time, she said. Her voice was hard and worn out sounding. Go ahead. When do visiting hours end? You can see him whenever you want, she said. Her heavy bangs over her dark eyes nearly obscured her eyes in shadow. We're always here. I nodded and walked down the hall. I felt sick, nervous. Deciding to do something felt fine until it actually became doing something. Then it wasn't cool at all. I was, in fact, terrible. The nurse hadn't helped. Something about her had seemed terribly off, like she was a hologram and not a person. One day we'll all be holograms, standing on the surface of Mars next to all the other holograms. Maybe, I thought, that's all that ghosts were. Technology we didn't understand yet. The further away from the nurse I got, the more certain I became she was watching me. The feeling became overpowering as I got closer to the end of the hall before I turned. Right then I knew. If I turned around, she would be facing me, her light-colored blue eyes watching me. It was like when I was a kid going down to the basement to get something. The horrors of the old furnace, the stacks of boxes, the old couch. Everything had a shadow, and I was convinced there was something hiding in all of those dark spaces. Something that would grab my ankle as I made it to the third stair, 4 steps away from the main floor from my Xbox and the refrigerator in my room. I could feel the hand around me, how there would be too many fingers, how a deep and quiet laugh would rumble, and in a voice, a strange, inhuman voice would say, "That's far enough, son. Come to me." And then the hand would pull me down, deep into the abyss of the shadows, and I'd never come out. When I was a kid, I never dared look back, but I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't a scared little boy. I looked back. Nobody there. There were patient room doors on each side of the hall leading to my grandfather's. All the doors were open. I tried not to look in, but I caught glimpses. Things under sheets that looked inhuman, tiny and frail on impossibly large hospital beds. Dying people staring at the ceiling, listening to the hymns of hospital machines, counting their last breaths. Everyone there wasn't dead, but not quite alive either. That half space instead, like when the sun is setting but hasn't set, when all shadows are stretched way out and the light looks unreal. Magic hour. What's the opposite of magic? Room 777. Stop. I took a breath and stepped in. A smell of disinfectants and bodily fluids, stronger in there than it was in the hallway, washed over me. The air was clean and pure at the same time, both things at once. Then I saw him. He was thin and frail with long white hair, greasy and unkempt, that came down to nearly his shoulders. A blanket was drawn up to his waist, and IV tubes were in his arms and in his pale, hairless chest. He looked so pale and ominous. For a moment I felt like he somehow wasn't even human, but when I made eye contact and the illusion vanished. His blue irises were watery, framed by rich streaks across the whites of his eyes, wrinkles across his face like spiderwebs in a garden. He seemed to be barely breathing. I couldn't believe he wasn't already dead. I stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Walk in? Just leave? Stand right there until someone told me visiting hours were over? "Come to me," he said. I didn't even see his mouth move, just heard his voice, an old voice stretched out and broken by age and dying. His eyes tracked me and his hands clenched and unclenched. His fingers knotted with arthritis nodes, clenched and unclenched. A loud crack from the outside and then a flare of light from the window. The room was illuminated by lightning. He looked bright white and eerie in that glow, and rain began to hit the windows. It sounded like drumming, an old tribal rhythm. I moved towards him in a daze until I stood by his bedside. "Grandpa?" I said, and then his hand jerked out and grabbed mine. It felt strong, far more powerful than I would expect. He squeezed and his grip hurt. His mouth was open, moving. He coughed and spit sprayed out. His lips were cracked, the skin hanging off them in long strips. When his tongue licked them, it looked like a red slug emerging from the ground. "There," he said. His voice was cracked and trembled quiet, but still somehow loud, especially in that room in the silent, death-filled wing of the hospital. "Waiting for you." I froze. His nails dug into my wrist. "What are you talking about?" "There, waiting for you," he breathed. "In the woods, we shall be as one. In the fields we will run. In the trees we'll see the faces of who we will be." "Mr. Dressen, I didn't know you had a visitor." I jumped. Behind me, a nurse had entered the room. She was short and heavy, wearing bright yellow Crocs, and her hair was in a ponytail. "I'm his grandson," I started, but she was already waving me away. "No problem, honey. Not at all." She stepped into the room and spoke loudly. "Dr. Dressen, how are you?" He didn't speak, just stared at her. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable, honey." She glanced at the machines which beeped and murmured, felt his forehead and adjusted the IV. Let me give you something for the pain. She adjusted some settings and his eyes went far away and then they closed. His breathing was shallow. I watched his chest rise and fall, a dying metronome. It's good for you to come out, she said quietly to me. You're his first visitor. It's sad when someone doesn't have any people at the inn. You need people. Nobody told me he was sick or anything. I didn't know, I mumbled, looking at my shoes. I understand. At least you're here now, huh? That helps. She reached her hand down, touched his forehead again. He's been here a couple of weeks, but he was in such bad shape when he got here. He hadn't really been able to talk. The other day he got really agitated. We finally realized he wanted something to write on, so we got him a pad and he wrote Tim and grandson on it. Officer Franklin is always here. He dates one of the nurses in oncology and she's always here, so he is too. And I gave him the note. Guess he found you. I'm glad. You need people, she repeated, especially at the end. He hasn't been able to talk? I looked at him, the tubes running in and out of him. He seemed barely alive, much less capable of speech. But he had just spoken to me. Hadn't he? Oh dear, I'm sorry. We stood for a moment, quiet in the artificial light as the rain pounded outside, a soundtrack to our silence. Listen, she said. I wish I didn't have to kick you out of here, but it's past visiting hours. You can come back at 8 first thing tomorrow. Sure, I said, somewhat dazed. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was after visiting. The nurse out there said it was okay if I went back. She gave me a puzzled look. Which nurse? The one out in front, the one with the long black hair. The nurse pursed her lips but didn't say anything for a moment. Well, she finally said, you must have been wrong. We walked out and I glanced back at the dying old man. His eyes were wide open, watching me walk away. I took the elevator down to the lobby and got off. Nobody was there and the lights made everything look underground. The rain was still pouring and the moisture made the windows fog so that I couldn't see anything outside. It felt like there was no world anymore, just the hospital, filled with the humans who were becoming ghosts. I took a breath and tried to shake the feeling that had gotten into me, but even the walk to the door felt eerie. Along the wall, in between awards won by the hospital and various regional distinctions, photos of staff members hung in memorial. A doctor who had died a year ago, a nurse dead for 10 years, an administrator just last month. I paused just before one photo and stared for a moment, and then walked out, convinced I hadn't seen what I knew I had. In the hospital, where my grandfather had said, "They're waiting." Is that what he meant? Or was he trying to say, "They're waiting"? They're waiting for you. Was that it? Did I want to know? Every town has stories, rumors, things that happened to a friend of a friend, to a kid who graduated from your high school a year before you started going there. A story your cousin swears really, truly 100% happened. Frost Road was in at least half of those stories. Kids went missing out there. Car engines stopped running and watches broke. Weird lights in the sky and complaints about missing time. Lost dogs were found dead out there. Stories about stone altars in the woods. I thought the stories were all bullshit, but I still half believed them. That night, headed out to my grandfather's empty house in Frost Road, they felt especially real. The rain had stopped again on my walk out there from the hospital, but lightning still smeared the sky with a dizzy brightness from far away. White and thunder faded in and out of my hearing. Thunderstorms in October always seemed wrong. Not yet winter, but not summer. The air felt heavy, but not like that choking humidity of deep July. Instead, there was a hollow thickness to it anyway, a dead weight. The street lights were on, spreading little circles of light onto the 2-lane road, and old ripped plastic bags fluttered like ghosts in the branches of trees. The forest came nearly to the road and houses had massive gaps between them. This is where the town began to disappear. where the woods that encircled the area began to absorb it entirely. Looking out of the trees, I wondered what was out there, what lived in the dark, what was watching me right then. The street was where the old money of the town had lived before they fled when the factories left and the economy bottomed out in the 80s. They left behind massive family homes, ancient red brick colonials with gables and endless rows of windows that no one could really maintain anymore. The only people that stayed were penniless, born poor but with a generic memory of old money, dressing in furs that stank of mothballs, eating cans of beans from food pantries and old gas ovens, playing detuned pianos in the shadow of decaying spiral staircases. This is where my grandfather lived. His house was set off from the road with an overgrown front yard. Wild tangles of bushes flanked the walk to the front door. Dirty water filled a cracked fountain. Statues of angels with broken wings stood in a semicircle beneath a crabapple tree, their heads nearly touching. The top windows of the home were boarded up, but as a guy who had broken into a lot of abandoned houses, I could see telltale signs of an occupied location. Someone lived there, or had lived there. I stood before the red painted door for a moment and then tried the knob. To my surprise, it opened, although it made a loud creaking sound in the quiet of the night. Was I hoping that the knob wouldn't turn, or was I glad it did? Suddenly, I was in a fever dream and operating in that strange, unreal realm. I opened the door. Inside, I could hear flies and everything was dark. An awful sweet smell lay heavy in the air, like chemicals. I couldn't quite place it, even though it seemed familiar. As my eyes adjusted, I was able to piece together some sense of the space. I was in an entranceway. I could tell there were rooms on either side of me, as well as what seemed to be a staircase in front. There didn't seem to be any light switches. I made my way carefully into the room on my left, feeling along the wall as I went. Before me, I could make out the outlines of furniture, couches, chairs. My hand finally managed to find a light switch. I hit it and the room I was standing in was made visible. It wasn't hoarders, but it felt like it was borderline hoarders material. If they had a very slow season, this house could have made the show. It was mostly the paper. Everywhere I looked, paper. Piles of it, overwhelming every flat surface, all over the ground. Bookshelves were filled with books, and in the space between the books and the bottom of the next shelves were more books. The television had books on top of it as well, a crazed leaning tower. I went over. The actual screen was covered in dust. I doubted it was even plugged in. I lifted and rifled through the ones on top of the TV. Something about metaphysics. The ones beneath it were field studies, anthropology of remote islands, history of the British Isles. There were also old maps of the town. The state game lands that surrounded the area were all marked up with red arrows and writing in a cramped, illegible hand. I stopped. Was that a noise? The house felt suddenly not empty, like there was a lurking presence in it, somewhere I couldn't see. I moved around slowly, looking everywhere. Nothing seemed to be anywhere I could see, but the darkness beyond the room in which I stood was deep and all-consuming. I took a breath, wincing at the smell which seemed to be getting worse, and walked into the dark. I turned lights on as I moved, and I imagined what the house must look like to anyone outside, each window sharply glowing like a fire opening or a message being sent. I left the lights on in the room I left, covering my mouth and nose with my shirt. The bright chemical smell still got in. Even though I didn't see or hear anything, I still felt like something was in there with me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to believe myself. Every room was like the last one I had left. Just books and dust. Only old books, strange, obscure academic journals, and ancient primary resources. I wondered how my grandfather had lived here, just wandering in and out of spaces, death waiting for him, or him waiting for it. When I turned on the lights in the study, I froze. There was no wall. Where a wall should have been was the night sky instead, dull and black, heavy with stars and an ill-fated moon. Malformed mountains loomed in the distance. The landscape was bleak and there were people standing in the house. Women holding out infants, babies, some alive and some long dead, tiny skeletons in blankets. To a figure, they were all standing around in a circle. The thing in the middle was a strange animal, like a goat or deer, but standing like a man, his hands out ominous supplication, staring right at me, eyes burning, old horns from extending from his head. A wreath of ivory wrapped around them. I stepped back, a scream dying in my throat as I realized the thing in the room was only a painting, a mural. The awful scene painted directly into the wall so it seemed real. I stepped forward and touched the dry paint. Who would have this in their house? Who was my grandfather? The lights flickered. The thing in the painting cocked its head. I stepped back, but it was already moving, the painting coming out of the wall, strangely two-dimensional and flat, reaching out a long, gnarled finger to touch my shirt. I screamed and pulled away, running into the living room, to the door. Get the fuck out, Tim, I thought. Get the fuck out. I turned to look back to see if there was anything following me, and I ran into something. I hit the ground, my shirt wet from whatever I had touched, and when I looked up, I saw what it was. Before me, hanging from the ceiling on ropes like slaughtered deer, there were 4 kids. I recognized them immediately. Maybe that's why I didn't scream. They were the missing 4, the teenagers who had vanished earlier this year in the woods. I knew their faces from the evening news, from the missing posters in Walmart. Now they hung before me, swaying in a breeze, their stomachs cut open and their intestines spilling out like ropes. Was I dying? That's what I thought then. These were the apocalyptic visions, the sort of things you see near the edge of death when the brain's opiate center releases everything all at once, the white lights of heaven as a chemistry reaction. The 4 bodies began to twist, their eyes opening and shining like spotlights. They held hands and began to wrap themselves together. Fingers melted into other fingers, and under the skin brown fur grew. The mass pulsed like a deformed heart until there were only one body, one awful shape that fell from the ceiling, from the chains, and when it rose again, it was a deer. I stood in the middle of ruined splendor, on a threadbare rug over stained old wood floors, its massive horn somehow nearly touching the 12-feet-high ceilings. It stared at me with bright eyes that glowed a strange white, like there were flash bulbs inside its skull, blaring out, illuminating everything. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could hardly even breathe. I was face to face with proof the world had suddenly gone seriously wrong and I had frozen in place. The deer moved, turning its terrible eyes away from me for a moment, and the spell was momentarily broken. I staggered backward, nearly out of the house, and then it turned again with those searchlight eyes and I was immobilized. Inside of me, there were now 2 people. The me that always was, and the new me. The me made from its eyes. The me who would follow this thing to any doom it led. The deer turned and walked further into the house, and the me that was no longer me followed. I walked downstairs into the basement. Water dripped all around us from the ceiling. A strange mist rose up from the ground. Hanging from the ceiling were 4 dead bodies, their stomachs open, organs dangling out like ropes. I blinked and they were dead deer inside, dripping blood, waiting to be cleaned. We walked by them without touching and the basement kept going, tunnels connecting to other tunnels into rooms of broken floors and cracked windows, of blood-stained walls and empty hallways filled with black flowers. I remember there somehow being trees that bloomed inside the house, but then the house was changing, the boards twisting into something else, dirt instead of wood. Inside became outside, and the house became a forest and dead leaves crumpled under my feet as I followed the deer. All around me I heard strange noises, breathing and movements in the deep woods. I saw shadows moving in other shadows. Some followed me, mirroring my steps like they were me. Some were dead. My dad, his skin and every glowing yellow from his livers failing, staring mutely at me. A friend I found after they OD'd. Here they were alive again, but their skin was just as milk white as when I found them, with a needle still in their arm like an arrow, their lips still blue like a sky after it rains. Some other things were there, things I caught sight of for a second and then lost them in the trees. They looked like animals but distorted. Long arms and stretched out faces, mouths full of teeth and hot fevered eyes glowing like dead suns. I kept walking, the path wet with blood. When did the forest floor become tile? When did the trees turn into walls and the dark stars mutate into migraine-colored fluorescence? The sounds of the forest became the noises of the hospital I had left earlier that night. In front of me, the nurse stood, her long black hair plastered against her decaying scrubs. The air smelled of smoke. "This way," she said, pointed with one finger down the hall. "They're waiting." Down the hall, a row of open doors on either side, pulsing lights. At the end of the hall, an old man stood with deer legs and ancient horns coming out of his forehead, wearing a crown of ivy. My grandfather. He was pale and withered, dying but still alive. Two things at once. "In the woods we shall be as one. In the fields we will run. In the streets we will see the faces of who we will be." His voice scraped against my brain. He stepped forehead and his horn scraped the ceiling, his hands extended towards me. I turned to run, and my feet slid out from under me into the wet tiles. My knees slammed hard against the surface and I gasped. I looked back and my grandfather walked on deer legs, his IV tubes trailing on the ground behind him. Go, 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 I thought, gasping, and I stood up and froze. The nurse stood at the end of the hallway, waiting, her mouth open, her body not entirely human, and I paused, terrified, and I felt a bony hand grab my ankle. "In the trees we will see the faces of who we will be," my grandfather whispered. His voice was no longer human. He was something else. My fingers uselessly pawed against the floor and he pulled me to him. The nurse opened her mouth to show deer teeth and I began screaming until everything went black. I opened my eyes and I was in the hospital. I had a moment of panic, but I knew it wasn't the place I had been. But the light was normal. People were talking outside my room. I could see orderlies pushing carts, doctors talking on phones. My throat hurt and my eyes felt raw. "You're finally awake," someone said. Beside my bed, a nurse was smiling at me. "You gave us quite a scare." "They found me," she said, "on the lawn at my grandfather's a few minutes before the fires totally absorbed the house. I was in and out of consciousness all night. I think I inhaled some of the fumes from the meth lab. I had mostly slept through the night, but there were some issues with an altered mental state. I was confused and disoriented, but they medicated me so I could get some sleep, and now I seem more coherent." She cheerfully concluded my labs were good and the chest x-ray from the previous night was clear. So all in all, I seem to have dodged a bullet. Fire? Meth lab? Altered mental status? "You had a rough night, dear," she patted my head. "And now that you're up, there's somebody here who wants to talk to you." Detective Franklin came in about 10 minutes later. He was still wearing the same clothes from when I last saw him in the cafeteria. "You look good, kid," he said as he walked in. "Glad to see me?" He winked and closed the door behind him. A lot of what he said was just filling in the blanks from what the nurse had told me. After my grandfather was admitted to the hospital, someone broke into the now empty house and set up a meth lab. That smell I had noticed earlier was acetone, a precursor. Whoever was running the lab must have left it running for some reason. Probably because they were on meth, the cop said. and all those chemicals had been left boiling. The fumes must have overcome me, made me hallucinate, and finally had knocked me out. At least I was out of the house before the lab blew and it all caught on fire. They found me unconscious on the front lawn. I must have staggered out before I was totally overcome. I was lucky, he said, to get out of there when I did. If I had shown up later, I'd likely would have been caught up in the blast itself. And, he said, a bit of bad news, kid. Grandfather didn't make it. He passed last night, right around when his house blew. Strange timing. He placed a plastic bag on the tray stand beside my bed. These are his things. What he had on when he came into the hospital. If you want it, it's yours. Detective Franklin walked out of the room. I looked in the bag. Hearing aids, an old wallet with nothing in it but insurance cards, and last, a shiny silver ring with a smooth substance in the middle. It looked like the deer horn ring the detective wore. I threw the bag and everything in it in the trash. That night, I left the hospital against medical advice. I had to sign a form. It felt very official. They wanted me to stay longer to make sure I was okay, but I told them no, I had things to do. In the lobby, I walked past the framed photos of dead employees in memoriam. I was looking for one particular photo, past the dead doctors, the dead administrator, and then I stopped. Where once had been a photo of the dead nurse with black hair was only an empty space. The photo and plaque that had been there was gone. I walked into the parking lot of 4Q 2 minutes after 11. The dead deer was gone. I paused at the spot where it had been and then continued into the store. Emmanuel looked up from behind the register when the door emitted its sad noise. Squatter fuck, how's your grandpa? He didn't make it, I said, walking behind the counter and clocking in. Sorry to hear that. I'm glad you got to see him. Me too, I nodded. It was an experience. What's that? He pointed, looking down at my wrist and saw I had forgotten to take off my plastic hospital wristband. Oh, nothing, I said. Just a wristband from the hospital. No, not the wristband, on your finger. That looks new. Expensive. You got money I don't know about? Emmanuel laughed and I stared at my hand. On my right index finger, a silver ring with a middle strip of antler.